Good afternoon, everyone, wherever you are. Thank you very much for joining us for this event titled Autocratic Governance and Market Reform in North Africa. I have the pleasure of being joined by Tin Hinane El Kadi, who's an associate fellow at Chatham House, and Timothy Kaldas, who is a non-resident fellow at TIMEP. My name is Mohamed Dahshan. I am also a non-resident fellow at TIMEP. So the way we're going to proceed with this is as follows. I will, with your permission, provide some introductory remarks on the topic before we move to our experts who were focused on sort of more specifically country case studies or country, shall we say, country zoom-ins on the issue of autocratic governance and markets. So following my remarks, I will invite Timothy and then Tin Hinane to offer their comments. After which we'll open the floor to the audience, where you'll be invited to ask your questions to the panelists. So a couple of housekeeping announcements. One, this session is public, and the other thing is to ask questions. Please use the question tool that should be on the right hand side menu of your application of your app. Do not wait until the speakers have finished their remarks to ask your questions. You're welcome to ask them at any point, and then we'll take them as they come and ask them to the panelists once we have moved to the Q&A part of that session. All right. So the topic of autocratic governance and market reform really goes into answering the question of what happens when that assumption that we tend to have regarding government, that government is for the people, no longer fully holds. But the government activity is done for the private benefit of some individuals. Some of them are in power, some of them may not. So what we defend as state capture in that case, which is the term that we shall be I shall be using going forward in my remarks, is state capture is defined as the efforts of individual firms to shape the formation of laws, policies, and regulation of the state to their own advantage. So it essentially is about how certain actors can change the rules of the game to ensure that the economic and political benefits of the work of a state lands in their own benefit rather than the public in general. So what's interesting here is that state capture one differs from regular corruption, because unlike corruption, which tends to shall we say seeks to selectively implement we'll try to circumvent certain regulations, state capture seeks to influence the formation of these very laws to their own interest. And that exploitation of resources can go from, skimming over the top, as we would like to say, or fully extractive, entirely almost colonial model, really, of resource extraction, where all of the states' value generating activity is directed towards the benefit of certain people. And of course, unlike regular corruption, state capture is often plainly legal. A very interesting example of that use of state resources, which has been quite fascinating for anyone observing North Africa over the past few years, has been the use of letters of credit in Libya, for instance. Now, letters of credit provide foreign currency at the official rate to importers, so they're able to access dollars from the central bank. But letters of credit have been systematically misused over the past several years. Oftentimes, importers will get foreign currency while they actually have no intention whatsoever of importing anything at all. An audit that was done actually in Libya a few years back, which ended in the suspension of 10 companies, found that out of the 10 companies that had obtained dollars from the central bank, only one of them actually imported anything at all. The other ones just took the money and laundered it, whether internally or whether within the country or outside. So if we're going to try to do an overview of North Africa and of state capture in North Africa, one useful thing to do is to look at indicators, at cross-country indicators. So if we look at the World Bank Worldwide Governance Indicators, which tracks governance performance across the world and presents it in quantitative value to allow comparisons, in terms of regulatory quality, Morocco and Tunisia still score highest, followed by Egypt and Mauritania, with Libya and with Algeria, and then followed by Libya at the end. The control of corruption, however, is something that the indicator notes has seen some decline in Algeria and Egypt, but has remained more or less steady in Tunisia and Morocco. Another interesting indicator is the World Bank Doing Business indicator, which interviews business people and see essentially how they are able to conduct their business, and what are their relations with the state, from permits issuing to conflict resolution. And it has been, and according to the latest data from the 2020 report, Morocco is ahead of the pack in North Africa in terms of doing business, followed by, so we got Morocco, Tunisia, Egypt, and then Mauritania, Algeria, and Libya trailing the ranking, unfortunately. But what is fascinating too is when we break down these indicators and we look at what are the issues that investors identify as being the main hurdles, we get very interesting insight on what are the issues of state capture that each country seems to be falling behind in. So in Egypt, for instance, investors, like the indicators that where the country seems to perform the worst in are contract enforcement and taxation. In Morocco, the issues that are the most problematic are registering property and access to credit. So this is interesting because looking at each one of these, realize that state capture presents itself in very different ways across countries, and therefore the reforms that we would ultimately want to suggest to states would differ from one country to another. Public debt is also a very interesting indicator, and it's particularly interesting, especially in light of 2020, which has seen countries dealing with a host of crises. We'll come back to that in a little bit, and consequently has seen public debt increase. So as of next year, so by 2021, Egypt, for instance, Egypt's debt is projected to reach 91% of GDP. For Tunisia, that will be 86%. So these are countries that are approaching sort of a red alert level of debt sustainability. And pardon me, I'll just move to the next point in the interest of time. Another very interesting indicator as well of governance and of economic governance is central bank independence. And this too is very interesting to look at cross-country comparison here. A very egregious example of the government sort of fighting outright central bank independence was in Algeria in 2016, where the president decided to essentially change the law and dismiss the governor of the Bank of Algeria, who refused to approve his decision to amend the credit and money law and resort to the creation of money. Now, the central bank independence is particularly interesting as well, because as a global practice in global governance, the central bank, when independent and when able to pursue the goals that are assigned to it by law, facilitates price stability, promotes transparency, and provides accountability to public good. So it becomes a particularly important resource for governments that have no intention to really serve the public fully, to ensure that they are able to capture the central bank and the monetary policy and aim it towards not maintaining prices for citizens, for instance, but to develop the sectors that they themselves believe is a priority for their own interest. Now, we mentioned 2020, and we mentioned the current economic crisis, and I'll probably end on this point. But right now, countries of North Africa are dealing with not just one crisis, but several, really. So we have, of course, there's COVID crisis, but also the economic and social crisis that followed. Some countries are reeling from the collapse in the price of oil, and of course, the governance challenge that come with all of this. Now, in practice, data tells us globally that countries that score well in the governance standards that we were just talking about have done better in terms of one, COVID response, so have shown fewer infections, but also have done better in terms of designing their economic stimulus programs and have been able to serve a larger number of citizens. Countries that scored poorly on governance have tended to, shall we say, deal poorly with the issue or kind of ignore it partially. So all of this, so sort of the point of all these introductory notes really is to highlight the importance of using that state capture lens when we're going forwards and looking how to support economic reforms and political economy reforms in these countries. So that means identifying the incentives and the political economy drivers of capture, and how that translates into shaping the laws, regulations of policies of the state, not to serve the population, but to serve the interests of those in power. Right. So thank you for your patience in hearing sort of my regional overview remarks. It is well time to move to invite Timothy Kaldas to share his opening notes on state capture and markets reform in Egypt specifically. Tim, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mohamed, and thanks for that context. Welcome to my bunker. Thank you for joining us. It's great to be with you today. What I'm interested in and what I've been looking at is not necessarily Egypt's value as an investment destination, but more about the relationship between money and power, and with respect to the state capture element, looking at how the latest regime in Egypt has sought to use the market and its relationship with the market as part of its consolidation of power. So money is a means to an end. It's not simply about corruption for the sake of enriching oneself, but also in terms of controlling the country and expanding political power over it. And I think that it invites us to analyze the processes underway since arguably 2011 and certainly since 2013 in a variety of interesting ways. I think that there's been a very large debate historically about the role of authoritarianism in economic reform. There's a lot of people initially who were of the view that you needed a freer society in order to have a free market, and then there was a big pushback against that, with a lot of people arguing that actually a strong grip on power might make it easier to impose difficult economic reforms. I think that this question needs to be revisited from a perspective of what are the intentions of the reformers, and what are their interests. So what we've seen in Egypt is from a very early period a focus on decoupling private economic power from political power, and trying to consolidate control by the regime. So even as in the Nasser days, we saw land reforms that took away an important source of not only wealth but power for the landed elites of the country who dominated political life, who dominated parliamentary life, as a means for the regime to consolidate their control of society, and in the process redistribute much of that land to a new middle-class constituency that would support the regime. And then we saw under Sadat a move towards drawing in foreign investment and foreign capital as the priority of the open door policy, the Infitah policy. But liberalization of the marketplace itself wasn't as important as I think a lot of people made it out to be. And domestic entrepreneurship didn't really take off in the way that a lot of people seem to believe. Where we start to see a more robust change in that front is under Mubarak, where he, especially in the latter half of his tenure, built up a civilian business elite for the regime that he could use as a center of power. And throughout the decades, the military's relative power in the regime configuration was actually declining a bit. And this new civilian business elite of the regime was on the ascendance in the latter years of Mubarak. They dominated the ruling party and its policies committee. Some even believe that certain members of that party were in the position to disagree directly with the president. They were also widely hated. And while during this time there was a lot of privatization of state-owned enterprises, which is something that the IMF and World Bank celebrated, a lot of that was captured actually by regime elites who were able, for example, to access loans from state banks that were zero collateral. They had preference in terms of purchasing these enterprises and state lands and enriching themselves through that process. And what I would argue is that the privatization of the state-owned enterprises didn't actually lead to a privatization on a political level. It only led to it on paper. The regime continued to own the enterprises, but through entities that were outside of the formal state. And so these regime-owned enterprises persisted with all the political interventions that entails and the advantages. Now, what happens around in 2011 during the uprising is, as it becomes clear that the regime is about to fall, the military intervenes, and not only do they push Mubarak out, but they target this civilian business elite that Mubarak had brought together. And so if you look at the people that were targeted in the arrests initially, and the people who fled the country and had cases brought against them, a lot of them were particularly from this one center of power, that regime business elite, and we see them kind of force out that group from political power, and to this day they've not recovered. Following 2013, when the military really asserts itself with the coup, they continue this process and double down by dramatically expanding their participation in the market. And what they're doing is developing an economy where they are the engine of growth. And they would argue that the military was the institution that was best suited to do this because it was the most organized. It wasn't just the military, of course. There are also companies run by the intelligence service and domestic security. But the argument is that they were, the most organized and effective and reliable in terms of delivering results. And in fairness, they've delivered a lot of results. They've beat deadlines on massive projects. But what they're doing in the process is ensuring that a lot of the state's spending and a lot of the economic growth is funneled through them. And something you can observe is that in the last several years, the economy has been growing, but the private sector has actually contracted almost every single month since the economic bailout of the IMF 4 years ago. And poverty has risen throughout that period as well. So the regime is capturing a lot of that growth. And also the private sector, it's not that they're not making money, they are, but in a very dependent state. So they're subcontractors of the regime in many instances. So for example, the massive infrastructure projects are often contracted out to regime-owned enterprises who then subcontract them to the private sector. And it's not that the private sector isn't making money. It isn't even, and they're doing well in many instances. But it's about building this dependency so that the money that they have is entirely dependent on the relationship with the regime, and their subservience to that regime as a result. So they cannot create independent political power. Because what was happening under Mubarak, for example, was that this center of power that was a civilian business elite was actually accumulating real political power. And it appears a priority on the part of the regime as it restructures the political economy to suit itself and its consolidation to not allow that to happen again. And so it creates a much more tenuous situation of dependency with the private sector, to avoid the emergence of much autonomy, I think. I think that's what we're observing. And the latest discussions of listing military companies on the stock exchange is actually a really interesting and innovative way for the military to raise capital, maintain this dependent relationship where the private sector is investing in them, and function more or less as a private equity firm that builds up companies, sells equity in them, and then uses that the money that they raise from that process to finance their expansion in the marketplace even further, as opposed to just depending heavily on cash flow and borrowing from state banks as they have historically. And so they're really doubling down and entrenching themselves in this respect, and they've secured a lot of buy-in from international financial institutions who, while somewhat critical, such as the IMF, continue to applaud them and continue to talk about outdated indicators such as the privatization of state-owned enterprises without appreciating how easily and how much more sophisticated they've gotten at moving around this target that's set for them, so that they can maintain all the political influence they want without the formality necessarily of the state's ownership of anything. And indeed, when these entities move outside the control of the state, they're even less. It's even harder to oversee them, to have oversight and make demands of the revenues that these companies produce, because. For example, military companies are not taxed. They don't pay customs. They're not subject to the same licensing rules. They don't have the same costs in terms of labor. In some instances, we've even got reports of conscripts doing the labor for their economic activities. And so it allows them to capture this wealth and the power that comes with it and distribute it in a way that helps them with their consolidation without without allowing competition to emerge. I'm not talking necessarily just about economic competition, but political competition as well. I think the two are actually potentially quite related. And that's not to say that the private sector would want to displace the other elements of the regime, but rather they would probably sue for a larger share. I'm not even sure that the public necessarily itself would benefit greatly if they didn't pursue this, but the economy would probably grow at a greater pace. It's not, I mean, it's known to most people the things that are necessary to make it so that Egypt's economy doesn't just grow a bit, but grows at a much greater pace. But the decisions have been taken for, I think, political reasons to make sure that growth is under their control. With that, I think I'd like to turn things over to Tim. I just realized I'm over time.
All right, Timothy, thank you very much for that. So I do have a question, actually, if you don't mind. So something you said about how the military industries sort of relate to the rest of the economy. A few years back, I met General Al-Assar, who was Minister of Industrial Production at the time in Egypt, and I asked him, well, sir, are you aware that many people in the private sector are increasingly worried and concerned about increased competition from state-owned and army-owned enterprises? And his response was, our door is open. Everyone is welcome to come work with us if they want.
Mm-hmm.
Which was both I mean, it was a friendly response, but also it felt to me that he wasn't entirely aware of the impact that this expansion of state-owned and military-owned enterprises had on the rest of the economy. Do you think so? That was a few years back. Do you think this has evolved over the past couple of years? Is the state increasingly aware of its impact, of the fact that it is very much sort of the behemoth in this market, or are they sort of operating without necessarily thinking very much of what their impact is?
I actually think it's entirely consistent. It's very similar to what the president said about listing military companies on the stock exchange. It's like everyone should be able to make money with us. It's this idea that it's natural that the regime will be the engine for growth, but that the country should collectively benefit from that. But so they don't see a contradiction, and they actually, I think, see it as their role. And so Assad's invitation, everybody can work with us, is consistent with a lot of things we're seeing. It's consistent with the fact that many foreign companies that come into Egypt increasingly partner with ROEs. We saw this when Mercedes was coming back. They met with the president and are reported to have partnered with a government-owned entity in order to resume assembly of cars there. We see this with the contracting sector and lots of partnerships with private companies. We see it in tourism. They're not disingenuous in that regard. What they fail to appreciate is that their aggressive posture, or they don't care, is that their aggressive posture scares away people from independently investing in the economy in a robust way, because of the risk that the military could just overwhelm them, like they did with cement. A totally oversaturated industry before they came into it. They built $1 billion plant when it was already oversaturated, and the government's one of the main customers of cement in the country because of all the infrastructure projects that they're doing. And it forced some companies to shut down their production lines. Others have looked at liquidating. And these sorts of actions, where they have all these resources, where they can totally flood a sector, is one of the reasons that people are nervous about more robust investment. And then on top of that, there's many stories in the business community about people being coerced into buying military products in order to get export licenses and other sorts of things, and a lot of anti-competitive practices that, again, make way for them at the expense of an independent market actors.
Excellent. Thank you, Tim. And also, I owe you and the audience a little apology because I did not introduce you properly. Kind of thought that would have been done earlier, but you know what? I think it's never too late. So if you'll allow me to post remarks, sort of introduce you a little further to the audience. So for those who don't know Tim, he is currently non-resident fellow at TIMEP. His research focuses on transitional politics in Egypt, regime survival strategies, political economy, and foreign policy, focusing a bit on Egypt, but also in the Middle East as a whole. He was formerly a visiting professor at Nile University in Cairo. Frequent commentator, you will see him in your news very often, and he has currently began a doctoral research project at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. So that would be the belated introduction. Sorry, I thought that would have been done before. All right, now I'm happy to move to Tin Hinane El Kadi. Thank you for joining us. Now this time I will actually get the order right. I'll introduce you before your talk. So Tin Hinane is a political economy researcher. She's an associate fellow at Chatham House in London. Her focus is on innovation and the knowledge economy, ICTs and development, state-business relations, and Chinese investments in North Africa. She was until recently working on a research project on North-South knowledge production at LSE, where she has sort of decided to join as a doctoral student as well. He's a former consultant at the World Bank, Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, and the Carnegie Endowment. And with this, Tin Hinane, thank you for your patience, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you for both your presentations. I thought it was quite good. Though I think I'm going to stand in contrast with both of you, because I come from a slightly more heterodox tradition, I think. So, I mean, I think that at some point we need to go beyond this whole market versus state dichotomy, to be fair. Yes, the Egyptian state intervenes heavily in the economy. So does the Algerian regime. But, the situation is quite similar in the European Union. The US economy is heavily regulated And China, which is the most spectacular development story over the past, century, or like ever really, you have a big state intervening heavily in shaping markets. So I don't think the issue is why do we have these states intervening in the markets, but rather why is this state intervention not productive for economic development? Why doesn't it create growth and improve living standards and achieve structural transformation? That is like the move from activities that are largely low in productivity, low in technology, informal, to high productivity activities. So I think this is the problem. So why does this intervention not lead to broad-based economic development, and not why is the state intervening in the market? Because I don't think that in real life the free market is very much a myth. Like I don't think we can find any situation of free market anywhere in the world. And again, yeah, market reform is absolutely not synonymous of economic development, right? We shouldn't have this kind of autocratic state on one hand and market reform on the other hand, like, the evil and the good. I don't see it this way. I mean, market reforms across North Africa, but Africa in general, produced a lot of inequality and even situations that were counterproductive to development and growth over the past decades. So I don't think we should idealize market reforms, and then we should just think about how some of these market reforms can be strategic and help broad-based development, while some market reforms can actually be counterproductive for development. I think, trying to explain why the China state intervention worked, and you have like this kind of today's second biggest economy in the world, and why didn't it work in Egypt and Algeria? I think, it's a complex question, and you'd have like many factors, like state capacity, institutional capacity, human capital development, resource endowment, and other factors. But to me, I think that politics is the fundamental issue here. And there is a very interesting literature emerging on political settlements. Broadly speaking, it explains that if achieving development and broad-based economic change is tied to regime survival, then you would have regimes making efforts and really doing their best to achieve structural transformation. That is development. But if development is seen as a threat to the survival of an elite coalition in power, well, it's very likely that it will never happen, because it's counterproductive and it does not achieve the aim of political survival, right? And I think that in the case of Algeria, we very much fall into this. So in Algeria, a dynamic and thriving private sector is seen as a threat to political survival. And anybody who works on Algeria would say it. I mean, the share of the private sector in GDP is still tiny. It's actually one of the smallest in the MENA region. And you find that, the many people within what we call the regime, this is le pouvoir. So experts on Algerian politics will know it's literally the power. This is how Algerians define their regime. It's le pouvoir. So it's this opaque network of primarily military elites, but also political and economic elites in recent decades, who have been ruling the country for the past few decades with some variations. And so this pouvoir, this regime, has always perceived an autonomous private class, a private sector, as a threat to its monopoly over power. And so you only have half-hearted measures to reform and half-hearted measures to enter into, a real meaningful change of the economy. But unlike Egypt, there is kind of another factor that makes this whole process even more complicated. And this is the existence of oil rents and hydrocarbon rents in general. So because the Algerian state get the bulk of its revenue from oil rents and rents from hydrocarbon exports, it feels kind of freed from the need to develop a competitive, industrial sector, a competitive private sector. And what happens is that whenever oil prices go up, you would see kind of very inward-looking anti-business policies being adopted. That was the case, for instance, in 2009 with the Uyahia law that kind of introduced this the preemptive right of the state to invest, and it kind of put this 4951 investment law, because oil prices were above $100 a barrel. And then as soon as oil prices go down, the regime starts kind of engaging in this discussion. So like, well, now we need to open up to the market. We need to have a dynamic private sector. But as soon as these talks and discussions are over, like if oil prices go up again, everything stalls and all, change stops, and ambition to reform. So I think there are factors that are very much tied to the structure of the economy. I think that rentier state theory does a good job at explaining some patterns of the Algerian economy over the past decades. And yeah, so even now, for instance, though, oil prices are low. They're at like around $40 a barrel. But we still see the same measures kind of impeding exports of manufactured goods, exports of agricultural goods. And Algeria, as it stands, has one of the highest concentrations of exports in hydrocarbons. It stands at 97% of the country's exports are in oil and gas. And even with low oil prices at the moment, we're not seeing any kind of meaningful push to diversify exports, because this would require kind of boosting an independent and dynamic private sector. I think there's another important reason beyond like the structure of the economy, and that is ideology. And I think it's often kind of marginalized from analysis. And when you talk with people from within like power circles in Algeria, the outside world is very much seen as a threat. It's never seen as an opportunity. And this is why Algeria, as it stands, like, is still one of the most, closed economies in the region, if not in the world. And that the brutal experience of French colonialism shaped a particularly strong sense of nationalism and sovereignty within elite circles. And this very much remained as of today. So when market reforms came in the 1990s, it wasn't done because the elite wanted to move from what was previously a socialist regime, but because Algeria was heavily indebted. I think total debt was above $25 billion at the time. And so the IMF came, and Algerian rulers were forced to swallow the pill of structural adjustment reforms. And the problem with these reforms is that they did not tackle those political factors just highlighted, and they did not tackle the ideological factors that could have impeded reforms. And they came in this kind of like one shoe fits all policies. You apply the same thing in Algeria, in Egypt, in Senegal, and whatever is what it was. And the problem with that is that by not sequencing and thinking the reforms in an intelligent and politically sensitive way, I would say, we ended up having counterproductive results, as trade liberalization opened the door to the rise of a big lobby of import. So you had new importers emerging who then kind of lobbied against the development of a strong, dynamic private manufacturing class. And so one of the major results of this period is that basically market reforms just shifted the state monopole to the monopole of a few oligarchs. It's what it did, literally. It shifted the monopoly from the state to a few oligarchs. And so you had military officials, political elites kind of opening import firms in the 1990s, and they had monopoles over the import of essential foods, essential like clothing, medicine as well, and they fought kind of the creation of a dynamic local manufacturing sector. And these problems very much remain today, although during Bouteflika's 2 decades in power, the circle of people benefiting from economic privileges kind of broadened a bit. We saw the emergence of notorious crony capitalists such as Ali Haddad, Koulinov, you have Tahkout in kind of very big capitalists emerging, but they were not supported by the state for their kind of productivity or their contribution in job creation or technological upgrading, but they were just selected as champions for their political allegiance. So it's these people who were then financing Bouteflika's like several presidential campaigns. He actually had 5. And these people were funding this and were like part of the game. Since the popular uprising in 2019, the military kind of reacted, and it sought to marginalize this kind of core civilian business elite that thrived during Bouteflika's era. And here I see a lot of similarities with what Tim was describing about Egypt's kind of civilian business elite that emerged during Mubarak's era. And while the people who took to the streets in millions in February 2019 asked for radical regime change, what the military decided to do to just like keep power was actually to engage in this large-scale anti-corruption campaign. And through this anti-corruption campaign, a lot of the oligarchs I cited found themselves in jail, but the trials were very opaque and they lacked transparency in many ways. So it was very much a strategy of the military to regain power and centralize power again. And the problem with that, in terms when we think about economic development and so on, is that this anti-corruption campaign is very much freezing every kind of initiative for entrepreneurship, and people within the business class are very much scared of investing and doing things they used to do initially. So for instance, I know that domestic credits to private entrepreneurs, to the private sector, have stalled for over a year now. So since the beginning of the popular uprising, there hasn't been much contracts, deals signed for bank loans. And so it has very much frozen domestic investment. And this is very risky for the future, especially considering the COVID-19 pandemic and the loss in revenues from oil. I think the economy is very much going into a deep crisis. And so, I mean, if I just like wrap up, if I could wrap up just to leave some more time for the Q&A, I'd say that, yeah, I mean, if we consider development as an inherently political process, it allows us to see things, I think, under a different light, and sometimes it gives us more insight on the success of some reforms and why some reforms like work and some other reforms don't work. And I think there are key political and ideational factors in that need to be analyzed. And so the IMF keeps saying that Algeria needs to reform and Algeria needs to kind of start improving the investment climate and support diversification of the economy and facilitate the emergence of a dynamic private sector. But I don't think any of that will happen without tackling the core political issues at stake. And international financial institutions will very much gain from adopting more politically sensitive frameworks before engaging in reforms in countries in the region. Thanks, I will stop here. Then happy to take more questions.
Right, thank you very much, Tin Hinane. That was absolutely excellent. Also, I think your closing remarks already partially answered one of the questions that we got from the audience, but we'll probably get back to it. I do have a quick follow-up question. How would you evaluate the government's response to the economic crisis, so sort of to 2020, to the health and economic crisis of 2020? Do you think it reflects, you know, does it still reflects that these dichotomies and these different priorities, or have the policy making around this issue been very much, you know, pro people without capture of personal interests?
I think so. I think that the government's reaction of like during the crisis has very much reflected the will of the political elite to maintain power. So there is a narrow security paradigm kind of used to handle everything from the economy to COVID crisis to education to everything. You know, the military is, you know, the institution that holds power in the country, and nothing is done without kind of the consent, nothing strategic at least is done without the consent of this institution. So there hasn't been much like reforms to help bail out like the private sector. You have like hundreds of thousands of companies that are like closing, shutting down because of the pandemic, but we haven't seen much help or much efforts. The only reaction is that we have a curfew. So the state is very much managing this as like if we were during like in a civil war. So there is a curfew, and we have like, you know, we don't have real statistics on the number of COVID cases, and we don't even have real numbers on the number of like deaths. And so it's a very poor management, and you can see that there is still a lot of competition between different clans in power, and this is very much weakening state capacity. So we end up having a ruling elite that's not even able to commit to its own promises. And we found ourselves in this very unviable, no development, no freedom situation.
Right, quite sobering. Thank you very much, Tin Hinane. Thank you to everyone who has already started putting questions. If you had to download this app specifically for this webinar, I thank you twice, because I know that it's not always very clear, but there should be a chat and a question bar in the right-hand side menu of your app, which you can use to ask us questions. So I'll actually start with so we've already received several. Let me start with, actually, so the first question goes to Tin Hinane from Tariq Radwan, where he says that Tin Hinane describes how China is an example of heavy state intervention, but that such intervention prevents broad-based development. But isn't China itself a counterexample? And is this theory limited to many countries?
Well, no, like my point was that China is a case of heavy state intervention, and I can give like several examples, whether in the telecom sector that's still just controlled by the state. There are no such thing as like a private telecom Chinese company, to other sectors, whether it's like in the banking sector, in the manufacturing sector, the state is very much present. And then I think the magic of growth and what happens, and when we read the history of economic development, it has never been just about opening up to markets and leaving the free market doing everything. I mean, whether we're talking about the UK or the US catching up or Germany catching up, it is this kind of heavy intervention of the state in strategic ways, protecting domestic firms and kind of opening up to competition when these firms are ready to compete. And I think it's of this game that the Chinese have been particularly strong. So starting from 1978, you have an inflow of FDI coming into China, but it wasn't done in just like a unthought way, you know, just capital flowing in. It was done with a lot of local content policies, with obligations on foreign capital to transfer knowledge, to employ local people. And then through time, the Chinese were able to mimic a lot of these processes and come up with, today technological giants like, Huawei, you have Tencent, and this is just in the digital sector, but there's so many examples in other fields. And so I think we need to move beyond this myth of the free market. Really, like the US economy is heavily regulated. Like go check regulations in the agricultural sector, for instance. It's a heavily protected economy as well. The EU is a very protected economy as well. I think that the challenge is finding the right balance between state and market. And I will stop here.
Cool. Thank you very much, Tin Hinane. Timothy, I will shift to you. And the question is, how do we get out of the vicious cycle? The question is from Nuh al-Harmouzi. Forgive me if I mispronounced your name. And the question reads as follows. To stop state capture, we need, of course, to change institutions, laws, regulations, etc. But how to manage to achieve this if military and civilian elites connected to power control parliament like in Egypt? How can we get out of the vicious cycle? $1 million question. Well,
I don't think I can. I don't think I can chart a path to successful revolution just here. I think. Look, I think that it's an enormous challenge to try to influence powers to take steps that they don't see as promoting their interests. I mean, I agree with Tin completely that this is largely political, and so when they're in a situation where they're in need of assistance or something like that, you can try to leverage that a bit, but I mean, there's a limit to how effective that is. It also presumes that the people pressuring them know what to ask for, which I think has been demonstrated repeatedly not to be the case. And I mean, I think when it comes to laws and regulations and reliable enforcement of contracts and things like that, in the case of Egypt, this all comes back to an issue that I think distinguishes Egypt from China, from the US, from Europe, and that is the arbitrariness of government intervention. I think that there isn't a coherent strategy. There isn't a strategy about channeling investments in a productive way or in a way that will, in the long term, position Egypt to take advantage of them. There isn't a situation where the state or the regime decides it wants to focus on particular sectors and silo those sectors and then allow for more private activity in other sectors, as we've seen in China. The situation in Egypt is that they kind of want to keep their hands everywhere, and when they see a sector doing well, they actually run towards it and kind of suffocate it at times, which just undermines its potential. There isn't a very high level sophistication about learning about how to strategically invest in those sectors. Even when there was a currency crisis and they were looking at trying to promote more domestic production to decrease their dependency on imports, we didn't see a coherent strategy about we're going to target particular sectors that we think we have a good chance to do well in and focus our customs there and build up capacity in those areas. We didn't see that. It was very all over the place. It was very rent-seeking oriented, where we think people who buy pet food are going to pay, their demand is inelastic. They're going to spend whatever we make them pay. So if we make the customs 300%, they're still going to buy it. And so the arbitrariness is kind of baked into everything, and having a coherent legal system, which I agree is important, that enforces rules in a consistent way, runs contrary to being able to have that kind of power. And so I don't see them making that concession, and I don't have the answer for how to compel them to do that. It's going to be challenged.
All right. Thank you, Tim. I know that was not an easy question. All right. Let me shift to a question from Mattia Giampaolo. Question for Tin Hinane. So in Algeria, hold on, I'm actually reading that with you. We still have mobilization in the street, and after 2 years of protests, can one ask, what's the idea of the square on the state's role within the economy? Essentially, is there, as I understand it, is there sort of a crystallizing image within the protest movement of what the role of the state should be in the economy?
I think that that's a really good question. And I think, yeah, as you rightly said, the protest movement, which started in February 2019, was only brought to a halt by the pandemic, but it's still very much going on virtually. And we've seen some new political initiatives emerging recently in trying to mobilize all major actors of the Hirak. However, the popular movement has so far only faced a stubborn military that has been very much unwilling to devolve any significant powers to the people. In terms of the economy, yeah, there was this very important mobilization around the change in the hydrocarbon law. So this happened last year, as I think around October, November last year, 2019, and the parliament decided to change the hydrocarbon law to further liberalize the market to foreign capital for further hydrocarbon, for exploration of new plants. And you had several people mobilizing against it and saying that, we don't want an illegitimate government to decide the fate of our natural resources and our economy. And this was quite a strong statement, although the reform in the hydrocarbon law passed. We saw a lot of mobilization around it. And so I don't think that the Hirak has a particularly clear economic agenda, but it definitely stands for, more, kind of a more dynamic economy that would also ensure social justice overall.
All right, excellent. Sorry, I was unmuting myself. Let me see if we can squeeze in one last question quickly, because that I think I don't actually have the answer to that. I'm curious to see whether either of you has a suggestion. The question is from Joey Shee, and it reads as follows: how can economic international organizations like the IMF or the World Bank update the indicators to more accurately reflect the nuances of market capture? Since we're, I guess part of what I was in my overview, a lot of what we're talking about was international indicators on corruption or market governance, but it's true that it doesn't very well capture, state capture. So how do you think we should improve?
I don't want to be maybe too radical on this, but I mean, I have a problem with some of these indicators. I'm not sure it's very useful. When you take the doing business indicator, well, China ranks very low on that indicator. I don't think that it tells the story of economic growth and structural transformation. I mean, again, sorry to repeat myself, but historically, you've seen kind of instances of states cooperating closely with the private sector. If you look at South Korea and the private champions in South Korea, private sector champions, well, they were quite close to the state, and it's this synergy that was able to produce the miracle that is South Korea. I don't think we would want a situation where the state is completely detached from its private sector. I think it's really about finding a balance where the private sector is not too close to the state to avoid creating instances of crony capitalism, but it's not completely detached. And so about these indicators, well, they could start by moving beyond some assumptions about what is corruption, what is some basic elements that I think would help refine our understanding of things.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much. Timothy?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely true that the state has a role in development. I think that piggybacking on that, I think that these organizations need to increase the sophistication of their political analysis as part of their review of the economy, how the markets work, how things are regulated. And they've I mean, a few years ago, we started to see a little bit of a mea culpa from the IMF and World Bank about the hardcore privatize everything approach. But they need to, I think, continue down that road and really study where is it that state intervention can be useful and where is it that, you know, it could be causing problems. And I do think coming back to this arbitrariness thing is really important. And it's not simply about passing good laws, it's about making sure that they're enforced evenly. Because in a lot of authoritarian contexts, you can have, I mean, there's free speech guarantees in Egypt. There are all sorts of things in Egypt on the books that are regularly ignored or twisted or selectively applied. And this is true of regulations, it's true of licensing, it's true of customs, it's true of so many things. And so trying to push for more consistent and predictable regulation, I think, is also really important, rather than pushing to get rid of regulation, to make it more functional with the market and cooperative and even engaging, as Tin has pointed out. I think that's somewhere where they can play a role, and to move away from kind of the anti-competitiveness and the arbitrariness of some of the current dynamics.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, both of you. Thank you for both your perspectives. Quite different and extremely challenging in their own regard. I will give the floor to May Saadani, who's the managing director of TIMEP, for her closing points.
Thank you, Mohamed, not only for moderating, but framing this insightful conversation. And thank you, Tim and Tin, for sharing your expertise with us on Algeria, Egypt, North Africa more broadly. At TIMEP, we very much recognize that you can't talk about the economy without governance, transparency, equity, and today's event was just another reminder, to me at least, of just why. And to our audience, thank you for your active participation. We got a lot of questions and hopefully we answered a bit of them, but we look forward to hosting you again at upcoming events, virtually and someday in person as well. And a final thank you to the TIMEP team behind the scenes who make events like this possible. No matter where you guys are joining us from, have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.